Domenico Ghirlandaio's was the first bustling and successful bottega in all Italy. In addition to the 25 frescoed panels and lunettes for the Tornabuoni choir at Santa Maria Novella, which had to be completed in the 2 years remaining of the 5-year contract, he had also signed agreements to paint an Adoration of the Kings for the Hospital of the Innocenti and to design a mosaic for over a portal of the cathedral. Every few days he made a trip on horseback to a neighboring town, which wanted him to paint anything from a small altarpiece to the hall of a ducal palace. Ghirlandaio, who never sought a commission, could refuse none. On Michelangelo's first day in the studio, he told him, "If a peasant woman brings you a basket that she wants ornamented, do it as beautifully as you can, for in its modest way it is as important as a fresco on a palace wall." Michelangelo found the place energetic but good-natured. 28-year-old Sebastiano Minardi, with long black hair cut to imitate Ghirlandaio's, a pale, narrow face with a jutting, bony nose and protruding teeth, was in charge of the apprentices. He was Ghirlandaio's brother-in-law, though not, insisted Jacopo dell'Andaccio, imp son of baker, through any willing of his own. Ghirlandaio married him to his sister in order to keep him working for the family. Jacopo told Michelangelo, "So be on your guard." Like most of Jacopo's deviltries, this one contained a kernel of truth. The Ghirlandaios were a family of artists, having been trained in the workshop of their father, an expert goldsmith who had originated a fashionable wreath called a ghirlanda, which the Florentine women wore in their hair. Domenico's 2 younger brothers, David and Benedetto, were also painters. Benedetto, a miniaturist, wanted to paint only the minute and precise aspects of a woman's jewels or flowers. David, the youngest, had signed the contract for the Santa Maria Novella along with his brother. Domenico Ghirlandaio had moved on from his father's studio to that of Baldovinetti, the master of mosaics, where he had remained until he was 21. Leaving reluctantly to open his own studio. Painting is drawing, and the true eternal painting is mosaic, he declared, but since few wanted mosaics any more, he had turned to fresco, painting the greatest absorber and eclectic in Italy. He had learned everything that the earlier fresco painters from the time of Cimabue had to teach. In addition, he added something peculiarly and brilliantly his own. Ghirlandaio had in truth embraced young Minardi as a brother-in-law after the younger apprentice had helped him paint his masterly frescoes in the church at St. Gimignano, a neighboring town of 76 towers. Minardi, who now took Michelangelo in tow, was amazingly like Ghirlandaio, good-natured, talented, well-trained in the studio of Verrocchio, loving above all things to paint and agreeing with Ghirlandaio that it was the beauty and charm of a fresco that was important. Paintings had to tell a story either from the Bible, religious history, or Greek mythology, but it was not the painter's function to look behind the meaning of that story, to search for its significance or judge its validity. The purpose of painting, explained Minardi to his newest apprentice, is to be decorative, to bring stories to life pictorially, to make people happy, yes, even with the sad pictures of the saints being martyred. Always remember that, Michelangelo, and you will become a successful painter. If Minardi was the major domo of the apprentices, Michelangelo soon learned that 16-year-old Jacopo, with the monkey-like face, was the ringleader. He had a gift for appearing to be busy without doing a lick of work. He welcomed the 13-year-old boy to the studio by warning him gravely, "Doing nothing else but hard work is not worthy of a good Christian." Turning to the table of apprentices, he added exultantly, "Here in Florence, we average 9 holidays every month. Add Sundays to that, and it means we only have to work every other day. I can't see that it makes any critical difference to you, Jacopo. commented Granacci, with the rare burn of acid you don't work on workdays. The 2 weeks flew by until the magic day of his contract signing and first pay dawned. Michelangelo suddenly realized how little he had done to earn the 2 gold florins which would constitute his first advance. So far he had been used as an errand boy to pick up paints at the dentist's, to screen sand, to give it a fine texture, and wash it in a barrel with a running hose. Awakening while it was still dark outside, he climbed over his younger brother, Buonarrota, sprang out of the bed, fumbled in the bed bench for his long stockings and knee-length shirt. At the bargello, he passed under his long stockings and knee-length shirt. At the bargello, he passed under a body hanging from a hook in the cornice. This must be the man who, failing to die when hanged 2 weeks before, had uttered such vengeful words that the 8 magistrates had decided to hang him all over again. Ghirlandaio was surprised to find the boy on his doorstep so early, and his buongiorno, good morning, was short. He had been working for days on a study of St. John baptizing the neophyte, and was upset because he could not clarify his concept of Jesus. He was further annoyed when interrupted by his brother David with a batch of bills that needed paying. Domenico pushed the accounts aside with a brusque gesture of his left hand, continuing to draw irritatedly with his right. "Why can't you imagine this bottega, David, and leave me alone to do my painting?" Michelangelo watched the scene with apprehension. Would they forget what day it was? Granacci saw his friend's expression. He slipped off his bench, went to David, murmured something in his ear. David reached into the leather purse he kept hooked onto his wide belt, crossed the room to Michelangelo, and handed him 2 florins and a contract book. Michelangelo quickly signed his name alongside the first payment as stipulated in the doctor's and apothecary's agreement, then wrote the date, April 16th, 1488. Joy raced through his veins as he anticipated the moment when he would hand the florins to his father. 2 florins were not the wealth of the Medici, but he hoped they would lighten the murky atmosphere around the Buonarroti house. Then he was aware of an enthusiastic hubbub among the apprentices and the voice of Jacopo saying, "It's agreed. We draw from memory that gnome figure on the alley wall behind the bottega. The one who draws the most accurate reproduction wins and pays for dinner. Cecco, Baldinelli, Granacci, Bugiardini, Tedesco, are you ready?" Michelangelo felt a dull pain in his chest. He was being left out. His had been a lonely childhood. He had had no intimate friend until Granacci recognized in his young neighbor a talent for drawing. So often he had been excluded from games. Why? Because he had been small and sickly? Because there was not enough laughter in him? Because he communicated with difficulty? He so desperately wanted to be included in the companionship of this young group. But it did not come easy. At the end of his first week, Granacci had to teach him a lesson in getting along with one's contemporaries. 13-year-old, heavy-boned Giuliano Bugiardini, a simple nature who had been friendly to Michelangelo from the moment he entered the studio, had done a practice study of a group of women. Bugiardini could not draw the human figure and had no interest in it. "What's the use?" he demanded. "We never show anything except the hands and face." Seeing the sack-like outlines, Michelangelo had impulsively picked up a stub pen and made a number of quick strokes which had put limbs under the heavy dresses of the women and infused them with a sense of movement. Bugiardini blinked his heavy eyelids a few times to see his figure spring to life. He was free of envy and did not resent the corrections. It was the 13-year-old Cecco, who had been apprenticed to Ghirlandaio at the conventional age of 10, who had taken the offense. The sharp-tongued Cecco cried out, "You've been studying from a female nude model." "But there's no such thing in Florence," protested Michelangelo. Tedesco, raw-boned redhead, fruit of an early invasion of Florence, asked in a voice edged with hostility, that how do you know about the movements of a woman's breasts and thighs, that you can put real people under their clothes? I watch the women picking beans in the fields or walking along the road with a basket of faggots on their head. What your eye sees, your hand cannot draw. Your hand can draw. Ghirlandaio is not going to like this, crowed Jacopo joyously. That evening, Granacci said confidingly, "Be careful about raising jealousies. Cecco and Tedesco have been apprenticed for a long time. How could they see any justice in your being able to draw better instinctively than they can after years of training? Praise their work. Keep your own to yourself." Now, at the apprentices' table, Jacopo was completing the details of the game. Time limit 10 minutes, the winter to be crowned champion and host. "Why can't I compete, Jacopo?" Michelangelo cried. Jacopo scowled. "You're just a beginner. You couldn't possibly win, and there would be no chance of your paying. It wouldn't be fair to the rest of us." Stung, Michelangelo pleaded, "Let me join in, Jacopo. You'll see, I won't do too badly." "All right," Jacopo agreed reluctantly, "but you can't have a longer time. Everyone ready?" Excitedly, Michelangelo picked up a charcoal and paper and began hammering down the outlines of the gnarled figure, half youth, half satyr, which he had seen several times on the rear stone wall. He could summon lines from his memory, the way the students at Urbino's school had so miraculously brought forth verses of Homer's Iliad or Virgil's Aeneid when the master demanded them. "Time limit," cried Jacopo. "Line up your drawings, center of the table." Michelangelo ran to the table, put his sketch in line, quickly scanned the other sheets. He was astonished at how unfamiliar, even incomplete, they appeared. Jacopo stared at him with his mouth wide open. "I can't believe it. Look, everyone. Michelangelo has won." There were cries of congratulation. Cecco and Tedesco smiled at him for the first time since their argument. He glowed with pride. He was the newest apprentice, yet he had won the right to buy everyone dinner. Buy everyone dinner. His stomach sank as though he had swallowed his 2 gold florins. He counted heads. There were 7 of them. They would consume 2 liters of red wine, soup of the country, roast veal, fruit making a sizable hole in one of the gold pieces that he had waited for so eagerly to turn over to his father. On the way to the osteria, with the others rushing ahead, laughing heartily among themselves, a loose thread began flipping in his mind. He ran the spool of his thoughts backward, fell in step beside Granacci. "I was gulled, wasn't I?" "Yes. Why didn't you warn me? It's part of the initiation." "What will I tell my father?" "If you had known, would you have made yourself draw badly?" Michelangelo broke into a sheepish grin. They couldn't lose. There was no formal method of teaching at Ghirlandaio's studio. Its basic philosophy was expressed in a plaque which Ghirlandaio had nailed to the wall alongside his desk. The most perfect guide is nature. Continue without fail to draw something every day. Michelangelo had to learn from whatever task each man had in hand. No secrets were kept from him. Ghirlandaio created the overall design and the composition within each panel at the harmonious relation of one panel to the many others. He did most of the important portraits, but the 100 others were distributed throughout the studio. Sometimes several men working on a single figure at a one-day spread of plaster, where there was an excellent angle of visibility from the church. Ghirlandaio did the entire panel himself. Otherwise, major portions were painted by Minardi, Benedetto, Granacci, and Bugiardini. On the lateral lunettes, which were hard to see, he let Cecco and Baldinelli, the other 13-year-old apprentice, practice. Michelangelo moved from table to table, doing odd jobs. No one had time to stop work to teach him. He watched Ghirlandaio complete a portrait of Giovanna Tornabuoni, painted as a separate commission, and then draw it for the cartoon of the visitation panel. "Oil painting is for women," Ghirlandaio said sarcastically. "But this figure will go well in the fresco." Ghirlandaio said sarcastically, but this figure will go well in the fresco. Never try to invent human beings, Michelangelo. Paint your panels only those whom you have already drawn from life. David and Benedetto shared with Minardi a long table in the far corner of the studio. Benedetto never worked freehand. It seemed to Michelangelo that he paid more attention to the mathematical squares on the paper before him than to the individual character of the person portrayed. Nevertheless, he was an expert with the instruments. For squaring up, he told Michelangelo, remember that the face is divided in 3 parts. First, the hair and forehead, then the nose, then the chin and mouth. Now take the proportions of a man. I omit those of a woman because there is not one of them perfectly proportioned. The arm with the hand extends to the middle of the thigh. So, the whole length of a man is 8 faces and equal to his width with the arms extended. Always remember that a man has on his left side 1 less rib than a woman. Michelangelo tried drawing to Benedetto's geometric plan with its plumb line and compass half circles, but the restriction was a coffin into which he could squeeze only dead bodies. Minardi, however, had an accurate hand and a self-assurance that breathed life into his own work. He had painted important parts of both lunettes and all the panels, and was working out a color pattern for the Adoration of the Magi. He showed Michelangelo how to tint flesh and tempera, going twice over the naked parts. This first bed of color, particularly for young people with fresh complexions, must be tempered with the yolk of an egg of a city hen. The red yolks of country hens are only fit to temper flesh colorings of old or dark persons. From Minardi, Michelangelo learned to let the green tint under the fresh colors be just visible. Put highlights over the eyebrows and on the top of the nose with a little pure white to outline the eyelids and lashes with black. From Jacopo he received not technical instruction but news of the city. Nothing nefarious was safe from Jacopo. He could pass by virtue all his life and never stumble over it, but his nose smelled out the nether side of the human nature as instinctively as a bird smells manure. Jacopo was the town's gossip gatherer and crier. He made the daily rounds of the inns, the wine and barber shops, the quarters of the prostitutes, the groups of old men sitting on stone benches before the palazzi, for they were the best purveyors of the town's yarns and scandal. Each morning he walked to the workshop by a circuitous route, which enabled him to tap all of his sources. By the time he reached Ghirlandaio's, he had a shopping basket full of night's news. Who had been cuckolded, was going to be commissioned by what art project, for who was about to put in stocks with his back against the Signoria wall. Ghirlandaio had a manuscript copy of Cennini's treatise on painting. Although Jacopo had not read a word, he sat on the apprentice's table with legs crossed under him, pretending to spell out the passages he had memorized. As an artist, your manner of living should always be regulated as if you were studying theology, philosophy, or any other science. That is to say, eating and drinking temperately at least twice a day, sparing and reserving your hand, saving it from fatigue caused by throwing stones or iron bars. There is still another cause, the occurrence of which may render your hand so unsteady that it will tremble and flutter more than leaves shaken by the wind, and this is frequenting too much of the company of the women. Jacopo threw back his head and laughed both bubbles at the ceiling, then turned upon the quite astonished Michelangelo, who knew less about women than he did of Ptolemy's astronomy. Now you know, Michelangelo, why I don't paint more. I don't want the Ghirlandaio frescoes to tremble and flutter like leaves in the wind. Amiable, easygoing David had been well trained in enlarging to scale the individual sections and transferring them to the cartoon itself, which was the dimension of the church panel. It was not creative work, but it took skill. He demonstrated how to divide the small painting into squares in the cartoon into the same number of larger squares, how to copy the content of each small square into the corresponding square of the cartoon, pointing out how mistakes that were almost unnoticeable in the small drawing became obvious when blown up to the cartoon size. For Giardini, whose clumsy body made it appear that he would have trouble whitewashing his father's barn, nevertheless managed to get a spiritual tension into his figures of the visitation, even though they were not accurate anatomically. He made Michelangelo spell one whole dinner period sitting for a sketch. After 2 hours, Berardini said, "Have a look at your portrait. I have already caught the expression of your face." Michelangelo broke into laughter. "Berardini, you have painted me with one of my eyes on my temple. Look at it." Berardini studied Michelangelo's face, then his sketch. "It seems to me that your eye is exactly as I painted it, and so is your face." "Then it must be a defect of nature," responded the boy. Taking an indirect route home, Michelangelo and Granacci entered the Piazza della Signoria, where a large crowd was gathered, and climbed the steps of the Loggia della Signoria. From here they could see into the Righiera of the palace, where an ambassador of the Turkish Sultan, garbed in eggshell turban and flowing green robes, was presenting a giraffe to the councilmen of the Signoria. Michelangelo wished he could sketch the scene, but knowing he could capture only a small part of its complexity, he complained to Granacci that he felt like a chessboard with alternating black and white squares of information and ignorance. The next noon he ate sparingly at Lucrezia's veal, lost and returned to the studio, empty now because the others were taking their riposo afternoon nap. He decided that he must study the drawing of his master.